Chapter 1. The Math That Should Have Been Impossible. August 1944. The war in Western Europe should have been over. The Allied juggernaut, 3 million men, 10,000 tanks, an air force so vast it blotted out the sky, had broken out of Normandy. The German Army Group B was collapsing, retreating, disintegrating. Generals on both sides knew it. Hitler's armies were bleeding out across 200 miles of French countryside. And then, on a narrow stretch of road near a town called Falaise, someone stopped them cold. Not an army. Not a corps. Not even a full division. 88 Tiger tanks. 88 machines, some of them running on fumes, some barely repaired from the previous week's fighting, held the neck of what would become the most catastrophic encirclement of German forces in the Western theatre. Held it long enough for 100,000 men to walk through a gap that should have been closed in 48 hours. This is the story of how they did it. Not just the broad strokes, the desperate counterattacks, the shattered armored columns, but the granular, almost unbelievable specifics. The engineering genius. The tactical doctrine that turned 88 steel boxes into a wall that 3 Allied armies could not break. This is the story of the Falaise Gap. And the machines that made it possible. Chapter 2. The Trap That Almost Was. Strategic context of Falaise. To understand what happened at Falaise, you have to understand what should have happened. It is late July 1944. Operation Cobra, the American breakout, has shattered the German western flank. General George Patton's Third Army is swinging south, then east, in the most dramatic armored advance since the fall of France. To the north, the Canadians and British under Montgomery are grinding through the bocage toward Falaise. The plan of genius, elegance and breathtaking ambition, is for these two forces to link hands east of the German armies, trapping every man, every gun, every vehicle that hasn't already fled across the Seine. The Germans see it too. Every senior officer from Rommel's successor Field Marshal von Kluge to Panzer Group West Commander Eberbach understands what's coming. Their forces are like a fist stuck through a closing door. The Allies are pushing the door shut from both sides. On paper, the Allied forces are overwhelming. The Canadians of the 1st Canadian Army, backed by Polish armored divisions, are driving south down the Falaise road. This is the northern jaw of the trap. The American 15 Corps, for divisions, hundreds of Shermans, is swinging north from Le Mans. The southern jaw. Between them. A corridor. A gap. A neck of land barely 15 miles wide near Falaise and Argentan. If that gap closes, Germany loses an entire army group. The war in the West might end by Christmas. The gap never fully closed. And it never fully closed because of what waited on the northern shoulder, an armored force under one of Germany's most capable battlefield commanders, built around the most feared tank in the Western theatre. What Hitler and his generals did in response to the encirclement was, militarily speaking, simultaneously brilliant and delusional. They ordered a counterattack westward, Operation Eltage, to cut Patton's supply lines. It failed catastrophically. But it did something unintended. It committed the best German armored forces deep inside the pocket, which meant that when the encirclement tightened, those forces were nearest the gap that needed holding. The 2 SS Panzer Corps, battered, under strength, running on nerve and improvised logistics, was directed to form the rearguard on the northern shoulder of the gap. Their weapon of choice. The 101st and 102nd SS Heavy Panzer Battalions, the Schwer SS Panzerabteilungen, equipped with Tiger I and Tiger II heavy tanks. Their mission, in plain terms. Hold the road. Hold the shoulder. Buy time. Every hour the gap stayed open was another column of German infantry, another battery of artillery, another convoy of horse-drawn supply wagons that made it through. Every hour cost Tigers. But the Tigers could afford to spend themselves, because each one that burned up protecting the corridor was trading itself for thousands of men. Chapter 3. The Machine. Anatomy of a Stopper. Before we can understand what happened at Falaise, we have to understand the machine at the center of it. Because the Tiger tank wasn't just a tank. It was a philosophical statement. A declaration that raw, overwhelming engineering could substitute for numerical inferiority. The Tiger I, a Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausführung E, entered service in 1942, and from the moment it appeared on the battlefield, it changed the rules. Not because it was fast. Not because it was cheap or easy to produce. But because it was almost impossible to kill at normal combat ranges, and it could kill almost anything else on the battlefield from distances most tanks couldn't even engage. Let's take this machine apart. Start with the armor. 100 mm on the hull front. 120 mm on the turret front. These numbers sound abstract until you understand what they meant in practice. The standard American anti-tank weapon in Normandy was the 75 mm gun on the Sherman tank. That gun, firing standard armor-piercing ammunition, could penetrate approximately 60 mm of vertical armor at 500 meters. At the Tiger's frontal thickness, 100 mm, set at a minimal angle, the Sherman 75 mm bounced. Not sometimes. Reliably. Consistently. The physics simply didn't work. To kill a Tiger frontally, a Sherman needed to get within 200 meters and aim for specific weak zones: the driver's vision port, the machine gun ball mount, the lower glacis junction. At 200 meters, you're close enough to see the crew's faces through their vision blocks. Close enough that when the 88 turns to look at you, you're already dead. The British 17-pounder, mounted in the Sherman Firefly, could penetrate the Tiger's front at range. But there was only one Firefly for every 4 Shermans in British armored regiments. The Germans knew the Firefly's distinctive long barrel, and Tiger commanders were specifically briefed to target it first. But the heart of the Tiger, the thing that made Allied commanders genuinely afraid, was the gun. The 88 mm Kampfwagenkanone 36. Derived from the Flak 18 anti-aircraft gun, which had already proven itself against tanks in Spain and North Africa. The 88 fired a 10.2 kg armor-piercing shell at 773 meters per second. That velocity, combined with the shell's mass, gave it penetrating power that nothing Allied crews encountered in 1944 could match at standard engagement ranges. At 500 meters, the Tiger's 88 penetrated 138 mm of vertical steel. The Sherman's front armor. 51 mm. The Tiger could kill a Sherman from distances where the Sherman couldn't even scratch it. The Sherman needed to close to killing range through a corridor of certain death. Tiger commanders at Falaise exploited this asymmetry with methodical ruthlessness. They chose hull-down positions, hull below the crest of a ridge or hedgerow, turret exposed just enough to see and shoot. From these positions, they could engage at 800, 1,000, 1,200 meters. Allied tanks trying to reach the gap had to cross open ground under fire from guns that could kill them at distances they themselves could never engage. Chapter 4. The King Tiger. Germany's final heavy armor bet. And then there was the Tiger II. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausführung B. Known officially as the Nigstiger, the King Tiger. And the name was apt. If the Tiger I was a fortress on tracks, the Tiger II was a citadel. 69 tons of steel. Frontal hull armor of 150 mm, sloped at 40 degrees. Turret front. 180 mm. Sloped. The combination of thickness and angle meant the Tiger II's frontal aspect was effectively immune to virtually every Allied gun in Normandy, not just resistant. Immune. The gun it carried was even more capable than the Tiger I's. The 88 mm KWK-43L 71. The longer barrel, 71 calibers versus the Tiger I's 56, gave dramatically higher muzzle velocity. It could penetrate 140 mm of armor at 2 kilometers. 2 kilometers. Most Allied tanks couldn't reliably hit anything at that range. The King Tiger was shooting across ground that Allied crews considered safe. Now, and this is important, the Tiger series had serious problems. Real ones. The kind that killed crews not from enemy fire but from broken tracks and seized transmissions. The Tiger I's track and suspension system was extraordinarily complex. The interleaved road wheels, while brilliant for ride quality, could pack with mud and require hours to clean. The Feifel air filter system, designed for the eastern front dust, was often removed in Normandy, the wrong decision, but the crews made it to save weight. Transmission failures were common. A Tiger with a broken final drive was a Tiger that needed a 12-ton crane and a team of mechanics. The King Tiger was worse. Its weight sat at the limits of what bridges in Normandy could bear. Its range, barely 170 kilometers on road, meant logistics had to work perfectly. In August 1944, German logistics were not working perfectly. Fuel was the constraint. Every Tiger that sat immobile because its fuel trucks hadn't arrived was one fewer gun in the defensive line. Yet at Falaise, this broken down, understrength, fuel-starved force managed to do what a fully equipped, fully fueled army could not: hold. The question is why? And the answer begins with the men who commanded them. Chapter 5. The men. SS Panzer commanders at the Gap. The men commanding these Tigers at Falaise were products of a system that produced, simultaneously, extraordinary tactical competence and profound moral catastrophe. Understanding them requires holding both things at once. The most famous name associated with Tiger operations in Normandy is Michael Wittmann, a Bavarian farmer's son who became the most decorated tank commander in German military history, credited with destroying over 130 tanks and 138 anti-tank guns. His attack at Villers-Bocage in June 1944, in which a single Tiger company paralyzed a British armored brigade, entered military history as a case study in aggressive initiative. But Wittmann died on August 8, 1944, before the Gap fully formed. His Tiger was ambushed and destroyed near Synthos, almost certainly by Shermans of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, possibly a Firefly. The exact circumstances remain disputed. What mattered for Falaise was the system he represented. German heavy panzer units developed a command culture of Auftragstactik, mission command tactics. Junior commanders weren't given step-by-step orders. They were given objectives and trusted to find solutions. In fluid defensive fighting, where the situation changed by the hour, where a gap opened here, a crisis appeared there, this flexibility was decisive. The man most responsible for the Tiger defensive screen at Falaise was SS Obersturmbannführer Heinz von Westenhagen, commanding the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. Working with the remnants of the 1st SS Panzer Division and later coordinating with the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, he built a defensive position that was less a line than a web of mutually supporting strongpoints. Each Tiger was a node. Each node covered specific terrain features. Any Allied force approaching the Gap had to cross the field of fire of multiple Tigers before reaching any single one. The mathematics of attrition meant that advancing under those conditions was costly beyond what Allied commanders could sustain at the operational tempo they needed. On the other side of the Gap, the Allied commanders were not fools. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, commanding the 2 Canadian Corps, was one of the most innovative Allied operational commanders of the war. His Operation Totalize, the first Canadian assault toward Falaise, had deployed armored troop carriers fashioned from stripped self-propelled gun hulls to move infantry at night through German defensive lines. Innovative. Bold. Partially successful. But Simonds faced a problem that tactics alone couldn't solve. His forces had to move down a single axis, the Seine-Falaise Road, into terrain that funneled them directly into the Tigers' killing ground. The Bocage and river systems on either flank restricted maneuver. The Tigers didn't need to be everywhere. They needed to be on the road, and the ridge lines that commanded it. When Totalize stalled, Simonds launched Tractable, a daylight advance using smoke screens and concentrated armor. But smoke cuts both ways. It blinded Allied tank gunners as much as Tiger gunners. And the Tigers, with their superior optics and crew training, were better at fighting in degraded visibility. Chapter 6. The Defensive Web. How 88 tanks held a 15-mile front. The terrain around the Falaise Gap in August 1944 was not the open tank country of North Africa or the steppes of Russia. It was rolling Norman farmland, gentle hills, sunken lanes, thick hedgerows, orchards, small rivers. The kind of terrain that breaks a tank assault into a series of individual engagements, where the advantage always flows to the defender. The Tiger commanders read this terrain the way a chess player reads a board. The high ground north of Falaise, the ridge lines between Saint-Sylvain and Soignoles, the slight elevations near Pertigny and Esters-la-Campagne, offered commanding fields of fire across the approaches. A Tiger hull down on a ridge could see for 1,500 meters across grain fields while exposing only its turret. The sunken lanes, the famous Chemin's Crows of Normandy, gave covered approaches for repositioning. A Tiger platoon could shift 2 kilometers laterally without ever appearing above the hedgerow line. By the time Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted the vehicles in a new position, they'd already engaged and moved again. For the Allied tank crews driving down the Saint-Falaise road in early August 1944, the experience was unlike anything they had trained for. The battlefield reports from Totalize describe it with bleak economy. Columns halted by single long-range shots from positions that couldn't be identified. Tanks burning in the fields. Crews bailing out and running for ditches. The unmistakable crack and whip crack of the 88, first the strike of the shell, then, a fraction of a second later, the sound of the gun that fired it. A Sherman could absorb perhaps one 88mm hit in a non-penetrating location, the track links, the external fuel drums, the sand skirts, before the next shot found something critical. Often, it absorbed none. The 88's kinetic energy penetrating 51mm of Sherman armor at 600 meters left enough residual energy to kill the crew, ignite the propellant stowage, and cook off the ready rounds in the turret. Sherman crews called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because it lit first time. This is not a comfortable chapter of the story. But it is an honest one. The Tiger screen at Falaise worked because it killed efficiently and terrifyingly, and because the sight of burning tanks, the visible evidence of the killing ground, influenced the decisions of commanders on both sides. Chapter 7. The Engineers. The men who designed the fortress. Behind the Tiger was a team of engineers who had been asked to solve an impossible problem. Build a tank that could survive the next war. In 1937, that meant surviving against the projected artillery of a future European conflict. By 1942, it meant surviving against T-34s and KV-1s that had already proven Germany's existing armor insufficient. The lead engineer at Henschel, the company that won the production contract over Porsche's rival design, was Erwin Adders. His team faced constraints that no British or American designer would have accepted. Use existing components where possible, maintain repairability in field conditions, and achieve specified armor and firepower within a weight limit that was immediately exceeded and then simply abandoned as a requirement. The resulting vehicle was over-engineered in some ways and pragmatically under-engineered in others. The suspension, those famous interleaved wheels, was a masterpiece of load distribution. The transmission, a Maybach-Alvar semi-automatic gearbox, was extraordinarily refined but extraordinarily complex. The Feifel air pre-cleaners, the hydraulic turret traverse, the Bosch generator powering the electrical systems, each was a sophisticated solution to a real problem, and each was also a potential failure point. The engineers knew this. The tank was too complex for the logistical system Germany possessed by 1943. But by then, there was no going back. Here is the central paradox of German heavy armor in World War II. The engineers built something extraordinary, and the industrial system could not build enough of them. In the entire war, Germany produced approximately 1,347 Tiger I tanks. The United States produced 49,234 Shermans. The Soviet Union produced 84,000 T-34s. Germany was producing precision instruments while its enemies were producing overwhelming volume. The Tiger I took 300,000 man-hours to produce. A Sherman required 66,000. At Falaise, the 88 Tigers in the defensive screen represented a significant fraction of all operational Tiger tanks on the Western Front at that moment. They were irreplaceable. Their loss was the loss of something Germany could not rebuild. And yet their commanders committed them, because the alternative was the destruction of an entire army group. The exchange was made. 100,000 men walked through the gap. The Tigers burned, one by one, until the gap finally closed. Ferdinand Porsche's competing design used twin air-cooled engines driving electric motors, a petrol-electric transmission system, radical for a tank. It failed its trials. The air-cooled engines overheated under load, and the electric system had reliability issues. The 90 hulls already built were converted into the Elephant tank destroyer. Had Porsche's system worked, Germany would have had a tank with superior cross-country mobility due to the electric drive's torque characteristics, the design principle that modern hybrid vehicles use today. An engineering path not taken, by a margin of overheating cylinders. Chapter 8. The closing. How the gap finally shut. By August 17, the gap had narrowed to less than 10 miles. The Polish 1st Armored Division, part of Simon's 2 Canadian Corps, had seized high ground at Mczuga, Hill 262, overlooking the escape route. The Americans at Argentan were within artillery range of the Falaise road. The trap was almost closed. Almost. The Tiger screen, thinned by losses and fuel starvation, was still fighting. The last operational Tigers were concentrated at critical choke points, the road junctions at St. Lambert-sur-Dives and Chamboy, the bridges over the Dives River. Each Tiger was now holding ground that should have required a battalion. Crews hadn't slept in days. Ammunition was being rationed. Mechanics were cannibalizing immobilized vehicles to keep others running. Inside the pocket, the last German units were moving under constant air attack, artillery fire, and the knowledge that the gap behind them was getting smaller by the hour. The road to St. Lambert was choked with vehicles, horses, artillery pieces. German generals abandoned their cars and walked. Infantry units dissolved into individual men, filtering through fields by night, hiding in barns and ditches by day. And still, the Tigers at the throat of the gap fired. Not to win. Not to counterattack. Simply to keep the corridor open one more hour. One more column. On August 21, 1944, the Polish 1st Armored Division linked with American forces at Chamboy. The Falaise pocket was officially closed. 50,000 German soldiers were captured. Another 50,000 were dead or wounded inside the pocket. An estimated 100,000 had escaped through the gap, including most of the senior commanders, much of the divisional headquarters, and enough trained soldiers to form the skeleton of armies that would fight again in the winter of 1944. The last Tigers were found abandoned on the roads leading east, out of fuel, out of ammunition, their crews gone. Mechanics had sabotaged the engines, blown the breeches. They were done. The Polish 1st Armored Division, trying to close the gap, was itself surrounded on Hill 262 for 2 days. Cut off, with no supply and surrounded by breakout attempts from inside the pocket and counterattacks from outside, they held until relieved. Their position was simultaneously the plug in the gap's throat and a target for every German force trying to break through. The Polish first lost 20% of its strength in 48 hours. Their stand bought exactly the time needed for the American and Canadian forces to close the trap. The hill is now marked with a Polish memorial. Chapter 9. Legacy. What Falaise taught the world about armor. The Battle of the Falaise Gap left lessons that military planners and armored doctrine writers have been studying ever since. Some of them have grown old. Others are more relevant today than they were in 1944. The first lesson is the power of the defensive. The Tiger screen at Falaise achieved a force multiplier of roughly 10 to 1 in direct armored engagements. That ratio, 1 defended tank killing 10 attacking tanks, is the upper bound of what good terrain, good optics, and superior firepower can achieve. It was not sustainable indefinitely. But it lasted long enough. The second lesson is the cost of complexity. Germany's Tiger program consumed resources that, allocated differently, might have produced 4 times as many capable tanks. The Allied approach, good enough, quickly, in enormous numbers, won the production war. But good enough often wasn't good enough in individual engagements. The Sherman crews paid the cost of that strategic calculation with their lives. The third lesson is the one that reverberates into modern armored warfare doctrine. Quality versus quantity is not a binary choice, but a spectrum, and where you position yourself on that spectrum must match your strategic situation. Germany was a nation fighting a two-front attritional war. It chose quality. The logic was defensible, the strategic situation was not. The fourth lesson, the deepest one, is about what armored forces cannot do. The Tigers at Falaise could hold a gap. They could not hold it forever. They could not be everywhere. They could not stop determined infantry filtering through at night, or artillery falling on the roads they were supposed to protect. The Falaise escape was real, but it was also a disaster. The men who escaped left their heavy equipment behind. The 100,000 who walked out of the pocket walked out without tanks, without artillery, without the logistical tail that makes an army rather than a mob. The German army that reformed behind the Seine was not the one that had fought in Normandy. It was a skeleton. The Tigers had bought time, but time was all they had bought. 88 Tiger tanks. Against 3 Allied armies. Against total air superiority. Against an industrial machine that was producing 1 Sherman for every day those Tigers held the road. They held for 9 days. 100,000 men walked out. It was not a victory. The war continued for 9 more months, at a cost of hundreds of thousands more lives. The men who escaped through the Falaise Gap fought again at Market Garden, in the Hurt-Gen forest, in the Ardennes. Many of them died anyway. The Tigers that burned on the roads of Normandy were replaced by nothing. Germany simply ran out of Tigers, and then ran out of men to crew them, and then ran out of fuel to move the ones it had. But in those 9 days, in those 15 miles of Norman countryside, something extraordinary happened. An armored force a fraction of the size of its opponent held a gap in a closing ring through which an army escaped. They did it through engineering genius that still commands respect. Through tactical discipline that military academies still teach. And through the kind of cold-blooded arithmetic of survival that is the most honest face of war. The Falaise Gap closed on August 21, 1944. The Tigers that held it are rusted into the French soil. The men who built them are gone. And the lesson they left behind is still being learned.